You have tried every method to reach the avoidant, to make them understand what their patterns cost you, to generate recognition that would motivate them to change. You expressed your needs clearly through careful communication that avoided triggering their defenses. You established boundaries you articulated explicitly, hoping they would respect limits you set. You withdrew strategically for brief periods, creating temporary distance designed to make them miss you and pursue. You demonstrated your worth through visible thriving, hoping they would recognize what they lost. You offered them chances to return, to prove they could show up differently, to demonstrate capacity for transformation. None of these approaches generated lasting change because all of them involved you remaining engaged in some form, communicating, setting boundaries that required discussion, withdrawing temporarily while remaining emotionally available, demonstrating your worth while still accessible to them, offering chances that kept the door open. Your continued engagement, however modified or boundaried, allowed the avoidant to maintain comfortable position where they could track your emotional state, could monitor whether you remained available, could avoid confronting permanent loss because some form of connection persisted even when that connection felt distant or constrained. Then you execute the one approach that operates entirely differently from everything you attempted before. You disappear into complete sustained silence that creates total absence of information about your emotional state, your well-being, your life, your feelings about them. This prolonged silence, not strategic, temporary withdrawal designed to make them chase, but rather genuine, extended absence that reflects your complete disengagement, triggers cascade of psychological effects in the avoidant that no amount of communication, boundary setting, or strategic distance ever achieved. The silence eliminates every mechanism the avoidant used to maintain defended comfort. They cannot monitor your emotional state when you provide no information. They cannot track whether you remain available when you offer no contact. They cannot avoid confronting loss when your complete absence forces recognition that something has fundamentally ended. The prolonged silence creates unique psychological pressure because it denies the avoidant access to information their defensive structure depends upon, while simultaneously forcing them to sit with the consequences of their patterns without any relief that your presence or communication provided. The silence will trigger their attachment system in primal ways that bypass their conscious defenses, will force them through psychological stages they would avoid if any engagement from you allowed them escape, will create presence through absence that exceeds any impact your actual presence achieved, will cause them to project meaning that reveals feelings they denied, and will eventually force the existential crisis their defensive structure organized their entire life around preventing. The silence will trigger their attachment system in ways words never could. The avoidant's defensive structure operates by managing their conscious awareness and their emotional responses through layers of psychological protection that interpret potentially threatening information in ways that preserve defended comfort. When you communicate your hurt, the avoidance defenses process your words through filters that minimize their significance, characterizing your pain as excessive, interpreting your needs as pressure, positioning your emotional expression as proof you want too much. When you express anger, the avoidance defenses use that anger as evidence that you are the problem, that your emotional intensity justifies their withdrawal, that their patterns are reasonable responses to your unreasonable demands. When you set boundaries verbally, the avoidance defenses transform those boundaries into control attempts, into manipulation designed to change them, into proof that you cannot accept them as they are. These defensive interpretations allow the avoidant to process your words without confronting the reality those words attempt to communicate. That their patterns harm you, that losing you would represent significant loss, that their defended position costs them connection with someone important. The avoidance attachment system, the deep mammalian circuitry that monitors for threats to connection with significant others and that generates anxiety when those threats materialize, remains vigilant beneath these conscious defenses. Yet as long as you engage through words, through visible emotion, through communication of any kind, the avoidance conscious defenses can intercept the threat signals before they fully activate the attachment system. The defenses process your communication, neutralize its threatening implications, prevent the raw attachment anxiety from penetrating conscious awareness. The avoidant can maintain their defended belief that they do not need you, that losing you would not affect them significantly, that they are fundamentally unbothered by whether you stay or leave. All because their defensive structure successfully prevents your communications from triggering their attachment system in ways that would force different recognition. Your prolonged silence operates entirely differently because it bypasses the avoidant's conscious defensive mechanisms by providing nothing for those defenses to process and neutralize. When you communicate, the avoidant's defenses have material to work with. They can minimize your words, can reinterpret your meaning, can transform your message into something less threatening. When you maintain complete silence, you provide no material for defensive processing. The absence itself becomes the communication, and absence cannot be minimized or reinterpreted because it is not claim the avoidant can argue against or emotional expression they can dismiss as excessive. The silence is simply fact. You are not there, you are not reaching out, you are not providing any information about your state or your feelings or your continued availability. This absence of any input triggers the avoidance attachment system at primal level that conscious defenses cannot adequately manage. The attachment system evolved to monitor for separation from significant others and to generate anxiety when that separation threatens survival. In ancestral environment, prolonged absence of attachment figure signaled genuine danger. The person might be dead, might have abandoned the group, might never return. The attachment system responds to prolonged absence with escalating alarm designed to motivate reconnection before separation becomes permanent. This primal response operates beneath conscious awareness, generating physiological and emotional responses the avoidant cannot fully control through their usual defensive mechanisms. The silence triggers this primal attachment anxiety because it creates ambiguity. The avoidance nervous system interprets as threat. When you communicate even to express hurt or to set boundaries, the avoidance nervous system receives information that you are alive, that you are thinking about them, that some form of connection persists even if that connection feels conflicted or distant. This information, however negative its content, actually soothes the attachment system by confirming that attachment figure still exists and remains engaged in some capacity. When you maintain complete silence, the avoidance nervous system receives no such reassurance. The absence of information activates the attachment system's threat detection because the nervous system cannot distinguish between prolonged silence and permanent loss, between your choosing not to communicate and your no longer existing in ways that allow communication. The attachment anxiety the silence generates manifests in ways the avoidant cannot easily defend against because the anxiety operates at physiological level before conscious awareness can fully engage defensive interpretations. The avoidant experiences physical restlessness, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts about you that emerge unbidden, impulses to reach out that contradict their conscious commitment to defended autonomy. These manifestations bypass the avoidant's usual ability to minimize significance of connection because they emerge from primal circuitry that evolved before sophisticated conscious defenses. From mammalian attachment system that cares nothing for defended narratives about not needing anyone and cares only about monitoring threats to connection with significant others. The prolonged quality of your silence intensifies the attachment system's response because brief silence allows the avoidant to maintain hope that you will resume contact, allowing their defenses to avoid confronting permanent loss. Extended silence that continues for weeks or months eliminates this defensive escape. The avoidance attachment system begins recognizing that the separation may be permanent, that you may never return, that the loss may be complete. This recognition triggers escalating anxiety as the attachment system attempts to motivate behavior that would restore connection before it becomes permanently severed. The avoidant experiences increasing psychological pressure to reach out, to restore some contact, to verify that you still exist and remain potentially available, all impulses that contradict their defended narrative about preferring distance and not needing intimate connection. The silence also triggers the avoidance attachment system by eliminating their ability to monitor your emotional state and thereby regulate their own anxiety about the relationship. Throughout the relationship and during any previous periods of conflict or distance, the avoidant could track whether you remained hurt, whether you seemed to be moving on, whether you appeared to maintain hope for reconciliation. This information allowed the avoidant to calibrate their own responses, withdrawing further when you seemed too invested, reaching out minimally when you seemed to be releasing them. The information served crucial anxiety regulation function by giving the avoidant sense of control over the relational dynamic. Your complete silence eliminates all such information, creating profound uncertainty the avoidant's nervous system experiences as threat. They cannot determine whether you still care, whether you have moved on completely, whether you might eventually return, whether you are thriving or struggling in their absence. This uncertainty activates attachment anxiety, because the avoidance system recognizes it has lost ability to monitor and thereby manage critical attachment relationship. Understanding why silence triggers attachment system in ways words never could requires, recognizing that the avoidance conscious defenses operate most effectively against explicit communication. They can process and neutralize, but operate far less effectively against ambiguous absence that provides nothing concrete to defend against. Words give the defenses material to work with. Silence provides only void, and void cannot be minimized or reinterpreted. It can only be experienced as the absence it represents. This absence activates primal attachment circuitry that generates anxiety. The avoidance conscious defenses cannot fully suppress, forcing the avoidant to experience at visceral level what their defended position has cost them in ways that your words, your visible emotion, your explicit boundary setting never penetrated their defensive structure sufficiently to achieve. They will cycle through denial, bargaining, and eventual acceptance of loss. The avoidance psychological response to your prolonged silence follows recognizable progression through stages that mirror grief process, revealing that beneath their defended presentation, they are processing your absence as significant loss rather than as relief their conscious narrative claims they should experience. Understanding these stages allows you to interpret any contact the avoidant initiates during your silence, to recognize which stage their behavior reflects, and to avoid responses that would interrupt the essential psychological progression your silence creates. The first stage involves denial, where the avoidant maintains that your silence is temporary strategic withdrawal rather than genuine departure, that you will resume contact eventually, that nothing has fundamentally changed in the relational dynamic. During this denial stage, the avoidant experiences your silence with relative comfort because they defend against its meaning by characterizing it as your attempt to make them chase you, as your performance designed to generate their anxiety, as your strategic distance that will end once you realize it is not producing desired effect. This denial allows the avoidant to avoid confronting that you might have genuinely released them, that your silence reflects actual disengagement rather than tactical positioning. The avoidant tells themselves they'll reach out eventually, or they're just trying to make me worry, or they need space but they'll come back. All interpretations that preserve their defended belief that you remain emotionally invested and available despite providing no evidence to support these assumptions. The denial stage can persist for weeks or even months, depending on the avoidant's defensive strength and their previous experience with your patterns. If you have historically resumed contact after brief withdrawals, the avoidance denial finds support in this historical pattern. They assume current silence will end like previous silences ended. If you have previously demonstrated continued emotional availability, even while claiming to move on, the avoidance denial incorporates this knowledge into their expectation that beneath your silence lies continued investment that will eventually manifest through your resuming contact. Only sustained silence that continues far beyond any previous withdrawal period begins forcing the avoidant beyond denial stage by providing mounting evidence that current situation differs fundamentally from previous patterns. The second stage involves bargaining, where the avoidant begins recognizing that your silence may reflect genuine disengagement, yet attempts to restore connection through minimal gestures designed to test your availability without requiring vulnerable pursuit. During this stage, the avoidant may send casual message referencing something that reminded them of you, may reach out with practical question that provides excuse for contact, may initiate communication through indirect channels like social media interaction or contact through mutual friends. These bargaining gestures represent the avoidant's attempt to restore some level of connection while maintaining defended position. They want to verify whether you remain accessible without having to acknowledge that your silence affected them, want to reopen communication without having to be vulnerable about desiring that communication, want to test whether you will meet their minimal gesture with response that allows them to resume comfortable dynamic where your investment sustains connection they do not adequately reciprocate. The bargaining stage reveals itself through the quality of contact the avoidant initiates. The messages carry studied casualness designed to suggest they are unaffected by your silence while simultaneously attempting to elicit response that would break that silence. The avoidant is not reaching out with genuine vulnerability or acknowledgement of what their patterns cost you, but rather is testing whether they can restore access to you through minimal effort that requires no real change or accountability on their part. This stage can involve multiple attempts at contact, each slightly more direct than the previous, as the avoidant escalates their efforts while still attempting to maintain defended presentation. The avoidant wants you to meet them halfway, to do the relational work of restoring connection from their minimal overture, to make their bargaining gestures successful without requiring them to demonstrate genuine investment or transformation. Your maintained silence during the bargaining stage, your refusal to meet the avoidant's minimal gestures with the response they seek, forces them toward the third stage of the progression. If you respond to their bargaining attempts, you interrupt the psychological process by providing the relief that allows them to return to denial or to maintain bargaining indefinitely. If you maintain complete silence through their bargaining attempts, you communicate that minimal gestures will not restore access to you, that their patterns have created permanent consequence rather than temporary distance, that nothing short of genuine transformation would merit your reconsideration of connection with them. The third stage involves anger and protest, where the avoidant's defensive structure responds to the failure of bargaining with frustration directed at you for maintaining boundaries that refuse to accommodate their defended limitations. During this stage, the avoidant may express resentment that you have cut them off completely, may characterize your silence as punishment or manipulation, may suggest that your refusal to engage proves you never truly cared about them. This anger represents defensive response to the growing recognition that they have lost control over the relational dynamic, that their patterns have generated consequence they cannot eliminate through minimal effort, that you have genuinely chosen yourself over continued availability to them. The anger protects the avoidant temporarily from fully experiencing loss by transforming grief into indignation, by focusing on your apparent wrongdoing rather than confronting their own patterns that necessitated your withdrawal. The anger stage may involve the avoidant reaching out with communications that carry hostile tone, that attempt to make you feel guilty for maintaining silence, that characterize your boundary as evidence that you were the problem all along. The avoidant wants to provoke response from you. Even negative response feels preferable to continued silence because any response provides relief from the uncertainty and demonstrates they retain power to affect you. Your maintained silence through this anger stage, your refusal to be provoked into breaking silence to defend yourself or to engage with their characterizations, communicates that their anger is irrelevant to your decision, that no manipulation will restore their access to you, that their patterns have cost them connection with you in ways that their displeasure cannot reverse. The fourth stage involves depression and grief, where the avoidance defenses begin exhausting themselves, and the raw emotional experience of loss penetrates conscious awareness. During this stage, the avoidant experiences genuine sadness about losing you, anxiety about the permanence of the separation, regret about their patterns. The defended narrative that losing you would be relief or that they are unbothered by your absence collapses as the avoidant faces the reality that someone significant has genuinely departed from their life. This stage represents psychological crisis, where the avoidant must sit with the full weight of what their defended position has cost them without defensive mechanisms providing adequate protection from that recognition. The depression stage may involve the avoidant reaching out with communications that finally carry genuine vulnerability, expressions of missing you, acknowledgements of how their patterns harmed the relationship, demonstrations of regret that lack the defensiveness that characterized earlier contacts. Yet even this apparently genuine vulnerability must be evaluated carefully because the avoidant may be experiencing crisis that motivates temporary change rather than having developed sustained capacity for transformation. Your response to contact during depression stage determines whether the avoidant uses the crisis productively to examine their patterns, or whether your renewed availability allows them to escape the crisis before completing necessary internal work. The fifth stage involves acceptance, where the avoidant recognizes that you are genuinely gone, that their patterns cost them relationship with someone significant, that no amount of bargaining or anger or grief will restore connection unless they develop genuine capacity for transformation. This acceptance may lead the avoidant toward two different paths. Some avoidants use acceptance as motivation to do real internal work on their defensive structure. Recognizing that avoiding future losses requires addressing the patterns that created this loss. Other avoidants use acceptance to reinforce their defended beliefs, concluding that intimate relationships are not worth the vulnerability they require, and committing more deeply to defended autonomy. Your prolonged silence creates conditions for acceptance regardless of which path the avoidant chooses, yet you cannot determine which path they will take. You can only maintain boundaries that protect your well-being while the avoidant completes their psychological progression. Understanding this cycle requires recognizing that your prolonged silence forces psychological process the avoidant would avoid if your engagement provided escape routes. Each stage represents the avoidant's attempt to restore defended comfort, yet your maintained silence refuses to provide the relief that would allow them to return to previous stage or to stall in current stage indefinitely. The progression occurs only if you resist breaking silence in response to their denial, their bargaining, their anger, or even their grief. Any response from you provides relief that interrupts the essential process of the avoidant confronting consequences of their patterns without defensive escape. Your absence will become more present than your presence ever was. The avoidant moved through the relationship experiencing your presence as background element. They barely registered consciously, taking for granted the countless ways you enhanced their life, treating your availability as baseline condition rather than as gift, requiring appreciation or reciprocation. Your actual physical and emotional presence operated with relative invisibility, because the avoidant's defensive structure filtered awareness to minimize the significance of your impact on their life, to avoid recognizing how much they had come to depend on you in ways that contradicted their defended self-concept of complete autonomy. The avoidant could maintain comfortable illusion that you were optional rather than important, precisely because you were consistently present. Presence without absence creates no contrast that would force recognition of what presence provides. Your prolonged silence reverses this dynamic completely. The absence you create occupies the avoidant's conscious awareness with persistent intensity that your presence never achieved. The avoidant cannot escape thinking about you when your absence permeates every dimension of their daily life that your presence previously touched. They encounter constant reminders of your absence. The silence of their phone that previously carried your messages, the emptiness of routines you shared, the missing element in experiences they want to share with you but cannot. Each reminder operates as intrusive thought that forces awareness of you into consciousness, regardless of the avoidant's desire to think about other things. The avoidant discovers that attempting not to think about you only intensifies their awareness of you, because every effort to suppress thoughts about your absence reinforces the recognition that you are absent. This paradoxical presence through absence occurs because the human mind orients preferentially toward absence and loss, rather than toward consistent presence. The avoidance psychological system evolved to monitor for threats and changes in their environment, to notice when something that was previously present has disappeared, to generate attention toward losses that might require response. Your consistent presence during the relationship provided no such threat signal. You were simply there, part of the stable background, not requiring particular attention or conscious appreciation, because stable elements fade from awareness. Your absence triggers the threat monitoring system constantly, because each context where you were previously present now contains gap. The avoidance mind cannot help but notice and orient toward. The absence becomes more psychologically present than your actual presence, because absence creates questions that presence answered implicitly. When you were present, the avoidant did not consciously question whether you still cared, whether you remained available, whether you thought about them. Your presence answered these questions without requiring conscious attention. Your absence transforms these previously answered questions into persistent uncertainties that occupy the avoidant's mental space. They wonder whether you still think about them, whether you have moved on completely, whether you might eventually break your silence. These unanswered questions generate ongoing cognitive activity that makes you more present in the avoidance thoughts than you were when actually present, because presence provided certainty that required no ongoing questioning, while absence provides only uncertainty that generates constant speculation. The avoidant also experiences your absence as more present because absence carries emotional weight that familiarity diminished during your actual presence. The avoidant's defensive structure successfully minimized the emotional impact of your presence through habituation. Seeing you, hearing from you, experiencing your care became so familiar that these experiences generated minimal emotional response. Your absence cannot be minimized through habituation because absence remains perpetually fresh rather than becoming familiar. Each day of continued silence reinforces that you are gone, that the separation persists, that the relationship has ended. The avoidant cannot habituate to loss that remains ongoing rather than becoming accepted fact. The emotional impact of your absence therefore exceeds the emotional impact your presence carried, because presence became familiar, while absence remains perpetually activating. Your absence particularly becomes more present than your presence through the avoidant's tendency to idealize what they have lost. During the relationship, the avoidant's defensive structure focused on your limitations, on ways you failed to meet some idealized standard, on aspects of your presence that felt pressuring or uncomfortable. This defensive focus on negatives allowed the avoidant to maintain emotional distance and to minimize your importance. Your absence eliminates the immediate triggers that activated these defensive devaluations. Without your actual presence providing material for defensive criticism, the avoidant's mind begins recalling the positive aspects of who you were and what you provided. The memories that surface most readily involve moments of connection, qualities you possessed that the avoidant valued, ways you enhanced their life that they took for granted. This selective positive recall creates an idealized version of you that occupies their awareness more powerfully than the defended filtered version of you they held during the relationship. The avoidant discovers that your absence intrudes into experiences they want to share with you but cannot. They encounter something funny and automatically think to tell you before remembering you are not available. They face difficulty and instinctively want your support before recognizing that your silence means that support is no longer accessible. They achieve something and want to share the victory with you before confronting that you are not part of their life in ways that allow such sharing. These automatic impulses to connect with you, followed immediately by recognition that connection is impossible, create repeated emotional impacts that make your absence felt more acutely than your presence was appreciated. Each impulse to reach you represents a moment where the avoidant's deeper attachment to you, attachment that existed beneath their defended presentation, manifests automatically before conscious defenses can suppress it, forcing recognition that you mattered more than their defended narrative acknowledged. The prolonged quality of your silence intensifies how present your absence becomes because brief absence allows the avoidant to maintain hope for reconnection that diminishes the absence's psychological impact. Extended silence that continues without relief forces the avoidant to sit with the absence as persistent condition rather than temporary situation. The mounting duration of silence creates increasing psychological weight as days become weeks and weeks become months without any contact. The avoidant cannot dismiss the absence as temporary when its duration exceeds any previous period of distance. The prolonged silence communicates permanence that makes the absence feel more real, more consequential, more present in the avoidant's awareness than your actual presence ever felt during the relationship when they could take your availability for granted.